I thought walking away was the safe choice, until her older sister warned me I'd regret it forever. Started like any ordinary weekend. I had been invited to a small family gathering, the kind where the air smells faintly of fresh coffee and baked pastries, and the chatter of distant relatives hums in the background. I wasn't expecting much, just a casual afternoon of polite conversation and light laughter. But then I saw her, her older sister. She wasn't loud or overbearing, yet she carried herself with a quiet, magnetic confidence that made people notice her without trying. She was beautiful, not in a flashy magazine cover way, but in a way that made you pause for a second longer than you intended. There was a grace in the curve of her shoulders, the way her fingers wrapped around a teacup, and the subtle way she tilted her head when listening. I couldn't help but notice how she moved through the room like she belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. When our eyes met, something small but electric passed between us. It was a glance, fleeting, almost accidental. Yet I could feel it linger in my chest long after I looked away. She smiled politely, but there was something in it that hinted at knowing more than she let on. My pulse quickened, though I barely knew her. We ended up near each other at the kitchen counter, both reaching for the same plate of cookies. Our hands brushed, and I felt the warmth of her touch, brief but oddly grounding. She didn't pull away quickly. Instead, she let the contact last just a moment longer, her fingers grazing mine as if testing the waters. My mind stumbled. It wasn't inappropriate, just significant. Her voice, when she spoke, had a richness that made it impossible to ignore. She asked a question about something mundane, the kind of small talk you usually tune out, but I found myself listening with full attention, hungering for more than just words. Her laughter followed, soft and natural, like wind rustling through leaves, carrying an ease I rarely encountered. I noticed the little details. The faint perfume that hinted at something floral and comforting, the careful but effortless way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she seemed genuinely curious about my answers without an ounce of pretense. Everything about her made me aware of my own nervousness, a mix of admiration, uncertainty, and something I couldn't yet name. Even as the gathering continued around us, I found myself drawn into her orbit. Every movement she made, every slight smile seemed magnified. I knew it was reckless to feel this way about someone I barely knew, someone older, someone far beyond my world in ways I didn't fully understand. And yet, there was no denying the pull, subtle but irresistible, that made my heart notice her long before my mind did. By the time the afternoon faded into evening, I knew one thing with clarity. This encounter, brief and seemingly ordinary, would linger in my thoughts far longer than I wanted to admit. Something about her presence unsettled and excited me all at once, a quiet tension that promised both discovery and complication. And deep down, even in those early, unspoken moments, I felt certain of one thing. Walking away wouldn't be so easy. After that first afternoon, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the way she seemed to exist in a space where confidence and vulnerability intertwined effortlessly. I found myself noticing the little things about her. The tilt of her head when she laughed, the careful way she listened, the faint crease in her brow when she pondered a question. Each detail drew me further in, stirring something I wasn't quite ready to name. It wasn't long before our paths crossed again, this time under circumstances that felt almost accidental. I offered to help her carry some groceries inside from her car, and she accepted, her fingers brushing mine briefly as she adjusted a bag. That brief contact, harmless in itself, lingered in my memory, a spark that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. She glanced at me with a soft smile, a little teasing, a little knowing, and I felt the subtle thrill of being noticed in a way that felt intimate, though barely a word had been exchanged. Our conversations began small. Comments about the weather, jokes about shared acquaintances, mundane topics that somehow felt weighty because they were shared between us. And yet, each interaction carried an undercurrent of curiosity, hers and mine. She would ask a question, tilt her head slightly, and watch my reaction as though she were reading the spaces between my words. I noticed how her eyes softened when I spoke sincerely, how a quiet laugh would escape when I stumbled over something awkward. I realized, with some surprise, that I was actively seeking these moments, craving the subtle attention she offered. There were touches, always brief and innocent, but deliberate in their warmth. A hand grazing my arm when passing a plate, a brief brush of shoulders as we navigated a crowded room, the way her hand lingered on the small of my back for a second longer than necessary. Each gesture spoke volumes, more than words ever could. I began to sense a silent dialogue, an exchange of small signals that carried weight and meaning, building a connection that felt fragile yet undeniably electric. Yet with every step closer, hesitation whispered in the back of my mind. She was older, more experienced, a world apart from my own in ways that intimidated me. The thought of overstepping boundaries gnawed at me even as my chest tightened with anticipation whenever she was near. There was something magnetic about her presence, a pull that made my rational mind war with the longing that surged quietly in my heart. Even in casual silence, our connection spoke. Sitting across from each other over coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, or walking side by side on a quiet street, I noticed the small, unspoken intimacies. The tilt of her head when she spoke, the warmth of her hand brushing mine against chance, the way our laughter mingled in unguarded harmony. It was in these fleeting moments that the tension grew, subtle yet undeniable, a slow-burning flame that neither of us dared to name aloud. By the end of the day, I realized something profound. I was no longer merely observing her. I was entangled in a delicate web of curiosity, admiration, and something more, something that both exhilarated and terrified me. The connection was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, but I felt it vividly. And deep down, I knew that each small moment with her was laying the groundwork for something I couldn't yet fully comprehend, a tension that would only deepen with time. It happened on a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the world seems to shrink to just the two of us. I had lingered a little longer than necessary, helping her organize some paperwork at her home. The air was thick with an unspoken energy, the kind that makes every glance, every gesture, feel charged. I could sense her awareness of my nervous tension, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she let the silence stretch, letting it settle between us like a fragile bridge, delicate yet inviting. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the words cut through the quiet like a thread tightening around my chest. "You'll regret walking away." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a tease. It was a statement loaded with meaning, delivered in a tone that carried equal parts warning and sincerity. I froze, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, call it playful exaggeration, but her eyes held something deeper, a quiet intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if she had peered straight through the layers of hesitation and uncertainty that I had spent weeks carefully maintaining. Her words hung in the room long after she said them, lingering like the faint scent of her perfume, wrapping around me in a mix of warmth and tension. I realized then that this wasn't about casual attraction or fleeting curiosity. This was something heavier, more complicated. Something that demanded attention, reflection, and perhaps courage I wasn't certain I possessed. The warning wasn't just about the present. It was a subtle foreshadowing of what might happen if I let fear or doubt dictate my choices. I could feel her gaze steady on me, assessing my reaction, almost daring me to speak, to acknowledge the silent pull between us. There was a quiet vulnerability behind her confidence, a hint that she, too, had something at stake in this unspoken connection. I struggled to maintain composure, aware of the weight of her words and the effect they had on my pulse. The room, once ordinary and mundane, now felt intimate and charged. Every small movement, the way her fingers lightly brushed the edge of a notebook, the slight tilt of her head, seemed magnified, as if the world itself had sharpened to focus on the unspoken tension between us. I wanted to walk away, to retreat into the safety of distance, to convince myself that this attraction was temporary and inconsequential. But the thought of leaving, of ignoring whatever this was, felt like abandoning a part of myself I didn't fully understand yet. Her warning had cracked something open, a small fissure of desire and curiosity that refused to close. For the first time, I recognized the stakes. This wasn't a fleeting infatuation. It was the beginning of something that could challenge my perception, my patience, and my courage. And in that quiet, tense moment, I realized that stepping back might be the hardest choice of all. Her words echoed in my mind long after I left that evening. "You'll regret walking away." I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing with certainty. I couldn't stop thinking about her. And for the first time, I wondered if perhaps this slow-burning connection was something I was meant to explore, rather than flee. After her warning, I found myself looking for reasons to be near her, to hear her voice, to catch just a glimpse of her expressions. Each encounter now carried an unspoken weight, a quiet anticipation that had not been there before. The tension between us was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. But to me, it hummed in the air like a secret current pulling us closer. It was a rainy evening when our connection deepened, though I didn't realize it at first. We were stuck indoors after her plans were canceled, sitting in her living room with the muted patter of rain against the windows as background music. I noticed how she crossed her legs, curling them slightly under her chair, and the way her fingers lightly traced the rim of her mug as if seeking comfort. It was an ordinary gesture, but I watched it like a small miracle. Our conversation turned unexpectedly personal. She began talking about her past, about moments she rarely shared with anyone. Her voice softened, carrying a vulnerability that she rarely let anyone see. I listened intently, careful not to interrupt, sensing that each word was a gift of trust. I realized then that these weren't just casual words. They were openings into her inner world, invitations to see her beyond the surface of confidence and poise. I responded with honesty, sharing a little of my own hesitations, my fears, and my doubts. The act of opening up felt like a delicate dance, both of us testing boundaries without overstepping them. In response, she offered a small, knowing smile, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me acutely aware of the space between us. It was electric in its restraint, a silent acknowledgement that something significant was unfolding. Our gestures mirrored this new intimacy. When I reached to adjust the blanket she had draped over her lap, our fingers brushed and lingered just slightly longer than necessary. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, her hand stayed there for a heartbeat, and I felt the warmth seep through my own skin. Sitting close on the couch, I noticed how her shoulder occasionally touched mine. The smallest contacts charged with a quiet significance that neither of us needed to voice. Even silence carried meaning. There were moments when words weren't necessary, when the rain, the soft lighting, and the gentle rhythm of her breathing created a bubble where only the two of us existed. I realized that intimacy didn't always require action. Sometimes, it was in the shared presence, the unspoken trust, and the mutual acknowledgement of feelings just beneath the surface. By the end of the evening, I felt a shift between us, subtle but undeniable. Our connection had deepened in ways that could no longer be dismissed as mere curiosity. I left with a sense of quiet exhilaration and nervous anticipation, aware that this slow, careful build of trust was shaping something far more significant than either of us had expected. The vulnerability she had shared had opened a door, and I could feel that stepping through it would change everything. The days that followed our shared vulnerability felt strange, delicate, charged, and impossible to ignore. Every interaction carried a subtle tension, like the air before a storm. I found myself acutely aware of her presence in a way that left my thoughts tangled and my chest tight with unspoken longing. Each glance, each fleeting touch, seemed magnified, weighted with an intensity one was only beginning to recognize. I struggled with hesitation, and not just because of her age or the social boundaries we both implicitly acknowledged. There was a fear of the unknown, of stepping beyond a line that could change everything. Walking away seemed safe in theory, yet each time I considered it, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. The pull toward her was not merely physical. It was emotional, intellectual, and impossibly intimate in its subtlety. We spent a quiet afternoon together at a local bookstore, wandering among shelves that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The casual moments, standing side by side, reaching for the same book, brushing shoulders as we moved through narrow aisles, carried an unspoken charge. Every minor contact, so seemingly innocent, left my heart hammering. I caught her watching me more than once, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips, her eyes shimmering with unspoken understanding. There was a moment, fleeting yet unforgettable, when she leaned slightly closer to read the back of a book I had picked up. Our faces were near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume filling the small space between us. Our hands brushed again as I reached for a different volume, and this time, neither of us pulled away immediately. It was a simple gesture, almost accidental, but it carried a weight neither of us acknowledged aloud. That evening, walking home together under the soft glow of streetlights, the tension reached its peak. Words were scarce, yet every glance, every subtle shift in posture spoke volumes. Her hand almost touched mine as we navigated a narrow path, the hesitation in both of us palpable. I wanted to close the distance, to feel the certainty of connection, yet restraint held me back. A mix of respect, fear, and the acute awareness that crossing that line could change everything. Internally, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Desire, admiration, guilt, and a profound awareness of the consequences of acting too quickly. I felt the magnetic pull of our connection, yet my mind clung to caution like a lifeline. Every second stretched, each moment of proximity both exhilarating and torturous. The subtle tension was unbearable and intoxicating all at once. By the time we parted that night, I felt exhausted and exhilarated simultaneously. I was acutely aware of the growing emotional weight between us, a tension neither of us could ignore. My mind replayed every small touch, every lingering glance, every breath shared in silence. I knew that something had shifted irreversibly. The emotional barrier between us was thinning, and the slow-burning connection that had been building for weeks was on the verge of igniting. And in that quiet, tension-filled awareness, I realized, stepping back would no longer feel safe, and moving forward would require courage I was only beginning to summon. The hardest choice was no longer between desire and propriety. It was between denying what we both felt, and the evening was quiet, almost unbearably still, as if the world itself had paused to let this moment unfold. We had ended up in her living room again, a space that now felt like a world apart, removed from all the noise, expectations, and complications outside. The soft glow of a single lamp cast warm shadows across the room, and the faint hum of a distant city provided the soundtrack for what I knew would be a turning point. We were sitting on the couch, just a little closer than usual, our shoulders brushing lightly. There had been an unspoken understanding in our recent encounters. The vulnerability she had shared, the moments of hesitation, and the almost tangible tension between us had all been leading to this. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the warmth of her presence as acutely as if it had a physical weight pressing against me. I took a deep breath, gathering courage, and spoke. My voice was low, hesitant, carrying the weight of the fear I had been holding back for weeks. I admitted that I had been afraid of crossing a line, afraid of the age difference, afraid of losing what we had if I acted too boldly. And yet, even in my hesitation, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward her. The connection, I confessed, had become impossible to ignore. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Her eyes softened, and I saw the trace of a smile, a small curve that carried understanding, warmth, and relief. Then she spoke, her voice steady but gentle. She admitted that she had felt it too, the growing tension, the subtle desire, the emotional closeness that neither of us had fully named. And in that quiet, unwavering acknowledgement, the air between us shifted. Without a word, she reached out, placing her hand over mine. The warmth of her touch was grounding, reassuring, and thrilling all at once. I felt a wave of relief and longing wash over me, the culmination of weeks of hesitation and silent yearning. Our hands stayed together, fingers lightly entwined, as if both of us were testing the boundaries of this new intimacy, feeling the gravity of the connection we had carefully nurtured. She leaned just slightly closer, resting her head briefly on my shoulder. The gesture was small, yet it carried a depth of trust and vulnerability that words could never capture. I felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet warmth of her presence. It was a YouTube-safe, tender moment, intimate without being overt, charged without being explicit. We sat like that for what felt like hours, talking softly, laughing quietly, and sharing small touches. The occasional brushing of hands, a light squeeze of fingers, a gentle shift closer on the couch. The fear, hesitation, and uncertainty of the past weeks melted away, replaced by a shared understanding and emotional clarity. By the time the night ended, the tension that had haunted me for so long had been replaced with a quiet, steady certainty. We had acknowledged our feelings, bridged the gap of hesitation, and discovered that the slow-burning connection between us was real, mutual, and something worth nurturing. And in that fragile, intimate space, I realized that the warning she had given weeks before, "You'll regret walking away," had never been clearer. We didn't need grand declarations. The simplest touch, the quietest words, and the shared presence between us were enough. In that moment, everything aligned. Desire, respect, and emotional intimacy coalesced into a quiet, enduring connection. Embracing the delicate, thrilling uncertainty that had quietly taken hold of us. The morning after our quiet confession, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't a dramatic surge of passion or a reckless decision. It was calm, steady, and deeply grounding. Her words, her touch, and the vulnerable closeness we had shared the night before lingered with me like the fading warmth of sunlight on my skin. Life around us went on unchanged. People laughed, worked, and lived their days without realizing the subtle shift that had taken place between us. But I felt it in every small detail. The way she greeted me now, with a smile that carried just a little more softness. The way her hand would occasionally find mine when no one was looking. The way silence between us had transformed from hesitant tension into something comfortable, safe, and meaningful. We didn't rush to label what we were. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises shouted into the night sky. Instead, our bond unfolded quietly, like a book written in whispers and glances. When we sat together in her kitchen, sipping morning coffee while sunlight poured through the windows, there was a sense of belonging that required no explanation. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about choosing each other moment by moment. Of course, there were challenges. I still felt the flickers of doubt, what others might think, the unspoken questions about where this would lead, the lingering awareness of our differences. And yet, each time the fear rose, I remembered her words, "You'll regret walking away." That truth anchored me. The regret of not trying, of turning my back on something so rare, would weigh heavier than any uncertainty. She too showed her quiet courage. There were moments when I saw vulnerability flicker in her eyes, when she wondered aloud if she was holding me back, or if the world would misunderstand us. But in those moments, I held her hand, steady and sure, and reminded her that this wasn't about the world. It was about us. We learned to cherish the small gestures. A reassuring touch on the small of her back as we walked into a room. A shared laugh over something trivial that no one else would understand. An evening spent side by side on the couch, not needing to fill the silence because our presence was enough. Those were the moments that shaped the foundation of what we were building: quiet, steady, and real. Looking back, I realized how close I had come to walking away. How easy it would have been to let hesitation win, to let fear drown out what my heart had known from the start. But I didn't. I stayed. And in staying, I found something rare. An intimacy that wasn't rushed, a connection that wasn't fleeting, a love that was as much about trust and respect as it was about desire. Her warning had been right all along. Walking away would have been my greatest regret. Choosing to stay, despite uncertainty, became the most meaningful decision I had ever made. And as I looked at her, strong, graceful, quietly vulnerable, I knew with certainty that this wasn't just a fleeting chapter in my life. This was the beginning of something lasting, something worth every risk. If this story spoke to you, please give it a like. It helps more than you know. Share it with someone who believes in love that defies expectations, and subscribe for more stories that unfold slowly, but stay with you forever.